I had some questions about Ukraine and Russia war. I'm a big history fan, and it's happening in front of us. But I just wanted some questions coming from a pastor, coming from somebody I look up to, somebody who may be looking at this whole war from a different perspective. All I'm getting is Fox News, CNN, and BBC.
Gotcha.
You know?
Yep.
So I'm just going to lead off and ask some questions. First, I've been watching too much news, way too much news for 4 weeks now. The war's been going on as of today. And like grossly, admittedly, it's taken the place of TV and movies for me. It's what I'm spending all my time doing.
That's your entertainment.
Yeah, it is. And it's sick, but it's true. And like even Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, I'm obsessed with his Instagram posts.
Yeah.
Obsessed. I can't stop. I'm not even a big Instagram user, and I can't stop.
Yep.
But I guess my big question is, like, I realize I'm suddenly addicted. How can I counter this behavior, and should I?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the questions, and that's why we're doing this podcast. We've had a bunch of conversations. You're on this side of the camera. You're always on the other side of the camera. And we've talked about, do we do a podcast about Ukraine? You're like, I got some questions. I'm like, write the questions down and send them to me. And so this was the first one. And I think it's a really good question because I think a lot of people find themselves there. And whether that's maybe to the degree that you are, and you've got, even a film critic eye, evaluative lens, you're looking at stuff through, but it's not only compelling, it's consuming a lot of our time. I think for me, one of the things that I would say, there's two different ditches we can fall in. We can be consumed and just go in too much, or we could be like completely disengaged and withdrawn and sort of stick our head in the sand as if nothing is going on. And there's a proper balance. Peter says this in 1 Peter chapter 5 in the Bible, cast all your anxiety on him, onto God, because he cares for you. And so it's this picture like of giving over our burdens, but it is impossible to give over our burdens if we keep picking something else up. So, watching a news channel, now an Instagram feed, of something else that's painful and heartbreaking and captivating, some ways in good ways, but other ways in ways that are just beyond anything that we're supposed to be dealing with. So I think finding a proper rhythm, I would not say stick your head in the sand and totally just withdraw, but I would also say you've got to be careful on the other side not to be overcome. Jesus says in Matthew 11, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle, humble in heart. You'll find rest for your souls. If I talk to somebody who's watching a bunch of coverage of Ukraine, they usually aren't saying, I feel rested. They're usually not saying, I feel light. They're usually saying, I feel weary and burdened. Jesus has come to me, those you who are weary. And I think part of what I would say is, stay in tune with what's going on in you. And I think that's sort of the reason you're raising a flag and you're like, I feel what's in me is not necessarily good.
Yeah, it's bad. It's very bad.
And it's not stop it. Just stop it, Jared. That's not the answer. The answer is try to find some kind of rhythm. I think that there has to be a counterbalance to the input of the things that are heartbreaking or like anger producing. There's a righteous anger that happens. There's finding a balance of things that would bring in some peace and giving that kind of anxiety over to God. Sometimes it's a lot easier said than done. After these 2 years we've been through, and now this isn't like a snap your finger and just something happens. This is like a discipline. This is habit. This is a rhythm to engage in, to find a new way to process what is constantly before us.
Yeah. I'm driving my wife crazy, crazy.
Yeah.
What's more upsetting to her, though, is her brother's in the Army.
Oh, yeah.
We don't know where he is, but he is infantry, and, you hear about the NATO response force, and you just kind of wonder.
And the unknown of all that.
Yeah, and just it's hard to not, it's hard to not be in it because this is blood, Not my blood, her blood, but
no, but
I like him.
It's
He's
close.
okay.
Yeah,
He's a
it
fighter.
gets really, really close.
That kind of leads to my next question. Biblically, pray for your enemies, right? And I know I should be praying for Vladimir Putin, should be praying for even Russian soldiers, which isn't a popular opinion, but it's what Christians believe, right? But what if I don't mean it? What if I'm just doing it to go through the motions?
Sure, absolutely. Do you just go through the motions because it's what you're supposed to do? It's a fair question.
Yeah.
You said it. Yeah, we should pray for a Putin because we are told to pray for our enemies. But I mean, actually, it's more than that. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said of old, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So Jesus takes it like the next level and says, oh, it's not just pray for your enemies, it's love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I have a couple other questions, though. What if we ask questions like, what do we pray? And what if we ask questions like, from what posture do we pray? So like, this is not a popular kind of thing in our day and age necessarily, but all throughout the Psalms, David has what's called imprecatory prayers. He's invoking curses on the enemies of God and others. So like Psalm 109, David is praying for his enemy, and he says, like, may his days be few. May another take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless, where they wander around like beggars, cut off his descendants, his wife like a widow. And so these imprecatory prayers
David's
are like,
a guy.
Totally. He's pouring out anger and frustration and disappointment. So there's the bookends that I was thinking about in this question. There's the beginning of our prayers. There's the end of our prayers. The beginning of our prayers, in some degree, we've got to say what's on our heart. Like if we're mad, what use is it saying, God, I'm really happy today? And he's like, I know you're mad. So why wouldn't you just say, God, I'm mad. God, I'm confused. The beginning of our prayers has this part of probably honesty, of confession, of helplessness and hopelessness. But here's the question, what's the end of our prayers? And if we look to Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, maybe the end of our prayers is something like, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If we look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, maybe the end of our prayers is not my will, but yours be done. We don't probably ever fully know what God is up to. So one of the things we're doing when we're praying is we're saying, we're giving you burdens, we're casting our cares on you, we're asking you, God, to intervene. We're asking that your will would be done, but we don't always know what's best. So one of the things I would say is, yeah, we do learn to pray for Putin, but sometimes, honestly, that prayer may come out as, God, get him. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Praying for our enemies is not this like we have to fake it and be inauthentic and just make something happen within our souls that's not even there. Prayer is really honest language before God. And if we're not feeling it, it's okay to say, I don't even feel it, God, but I'm still praying to you because I don't know what else to do. And trying to be sincere before God and hand over these burdens into his lap. Believing, and this is sometimes hard, believing he still is in control and believing he's still good, even though we don't see evidence of that in a moment.
Yeah. I remember when the war first kicked off, I mean, there was a leading up to it, right? And then it was Putin's the aggressor, Putin's going in.
Right.
And I just felt this like, well, where do I sign up?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because this is not okay.
Yep.
You know?
You wanted to do something.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's a classic story of, bully versus can't defend themselves.
Totally.
And it's captivating. It's
Absolutely.
captivating.
Absolutely.
This is interesting too. So I part of a high school community group, right, on Wednesday nights. And one of the
Not
students.
that you're in high school.
I'm not in
You're
high
helping
school.
to lead
I look
high
like
school.
I'm in high school. I'm not in high school. But this kid is planning on going into the Army when he graduates. And he had an interesting question. This was like a week or so into the war. He said, if an American soldier is called into action, is killing justified in a conflict like this?
Yeah.
Or if this were to escalate and suddenly it's NATO versus Russia and whoever
Absolutely.
else?
Well, another great question. I should have said this earlier. I am not an expert. So I'm not coming to this conversation as an expert.
Yeah.
I'm coming as your friend and as a pastor. This got me thinking on things I haven't thought about in some time. So I appreciate the question. From early church fathers to groups in more recent history like Quakers, Mennonites, Amish. Some have said the way of following Jesus is the way of pacifism, and there's no other option. From other early church fathers, Augustine, some say Augustine, he's thought to be one of the first ones who taught this idea of a just war theory. The just war theory is there's a right of self-defense, a right to intervene on behalf of those who are unjustly attacked. Just war theory would say killing in war is not murder, but it's a defense of virtue and piety. And so there's sort of really two different camps. There's a Washington Post article I found looking into this a few years ago from a lady named Christine Imba. I thought this was fascinating. She said, just war theory has three levels. The justification of war in the first place. Why did we enter this conflict? Is it a just reason to enter this conflict? Like, why did Putin invade a sovereign nation called Ukraine? That seems to be a violation. But secondly, just war theory says, what's justice in war look like? Conduct in battle, usually applied to leaders, generals, soldiers. But then there's also justice after the war. What's the goal?
Yeah.
Is it a land grab, or is it a hopes? For us, is it just, would we intervene just to not care about the consequences, which is a pretty dangerous thing in this specific instance? Or is it with hopes of establishing peace, with responsibility and accountability after the war is over? I think at the core of this, whether you're the person who lands on the far end of the spectrum of pacifism or the end of the spectrum on finding a just reason and a just cause, at the end of the day, there's something like beneath the surface. And it's a flippancy that I see that scares me in some ways, a flippancy in treating the lives of some people as worthless. It feels like that's what Putin's doing. Well, those Ukrainians their lives aren't as worthy as our lives. Yeah. So they're bombing schools and hospitals and apartment places. But it's not just over there. Like, this is the crazy thing on my app on my phone next door. I get all this stuff about coyotes and whatever. But there's a home invasion not long ago in this area. And I think the homeowner shot and killed the intruder. And I was appalled to read some of the comments. Got what he deserved. Good job taking him out. And I was like, what kind of flippancy are we? Like, did the guy do something wrong? Absolutely. Is it a reason to celebrate the loss of the life? Absolutely not. And so historically, biblically informed, Christ-following people may fall in different places, but I think the heart of the issue underneath it is, how do we stay focused on loving God and loving others, even in the middle of conflict? And sometimes we'll find ourselves on opposite sides of conflicts, and sometimes we don't get to make that call. And I think the reality is sometimes a young man like you're talking about, who wants to do an honorable thing and wants to serve his country, then is in, sort of a position of just do what the leaders say. Yeah. And that's not that different than some of the Russian soldiers who don't even necessarily know what they're doing. They're just doing what their leaders tell them. And so it is an incredibly complex thing where there's not necessarily one completely right and one completely wrong. There's blurriness all along the way in situations like this.
Yeah. And we tried to I lead this group with Connor.
Yep.
We tried to answer the question, but it's so complex.
It is very difficult, yeah.
And then it kind of brings up the question of nationalism versus what you believe, right? You can say religion or Christianity or whatever, but it's interesting. You're pitting two core values against each other, you know? Yep. Which actually kind of leads to my next question. So the misinformation war is on. I think this is one of the most modern warfare, social media mixed in. It's coming from all angles, right? Mm-hmm. Our media is telling us that Russia's evil, that Vladimir Putin's the next Hitler. And it looks like that based off what we're being fed. Simultaneously, the Russian media is telling them that Ukraine is evil and we're evil, the West, America, because we're standing on their side. Well, not so much we're standing on their side, but
it feels like everybody's had to choose a side to some degree or another.
100%. Yep, for sure. And even I don't even know why this title matters, but he's the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Russian Orthodox Church. Apparently
That's quite the title.
A Putin friend, according to BBC News. He has supported the war, calling Ukrainians evil. My question is, who's right?
Right.
Who's wrong? And more importantly, where does Jesus land on this?
Totally. One of the most complicated things is probably to say who's right and who's wrong. As if one side is 100% always in the right and another side is 100% always in the wrong. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that wisdom and discernment are needed to make sense of all the news and information that is bombarding us. You can take one event in our nation. You can look at two different news channels that would define that event, that same event, from radically different perspectives. So this isn't just Russia's news versus Ukraine's news or the West's news. This is just two different news stations covering the same thing in the United States with completely different perspectives. It used to be said that news is unbiased and sort of priding themselves. It feels like we sort of lost that. Like everybody, that's out the window. Everybody
the opinion
knows,
has taken over.
Everybody knows news is business. And so you're trying to serve your constituency and your sponsors. But the question, whose side is God on? I actually think is really clear. God stands on the side of the vulnerable. God stands on the side of the oppressed. God stands on the side of life. God stands on the side of his kingdom work. So like Joshua chapter 5, there's this really cool thing that happens where Joshua is sort of in between battles, and it's a tough season in the nation of Israel. And there's this moment where Joshua has this encounter with, the title is the commander of the Lord's army. And so what we would think is this is a sort of early version of Jesus showing up, pre-incarnate version of Jesus. And so he's got a sword. And Joshua is like, are you for us or are you for our enemies? And the answer comes back, no. And like, what? Like, I thought there's the two choices, either them or either them. No. Basically saying, I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to take over, if people would let me.
I think this is from the Joshua series.
Yes, and I think in a series like this of events in our world, we want to pit the good guys versus the bad guys as if God is on the side of one of those exclusively. And there are, I have to believe, God-fearing, Jesus-following people in Russia who want to do what's right. And there are probably people in Ukraine who are evil and want to see bad things happen. And so to say that it's clearly 100% one way or the other, in this moment, from everything that I know, which I'm no expert, it seems pretty honest and pretty clear, Russia's the aggressor. Russia's the invader. Russia's the one bombing innocent civilians inside of Ukraine's sovereign boundaries. So on that point, it's like, how can you do that? And what do we do to counteract that? Now, can we do everything that Zelensky wants us to do? Well, now that gets infinitely complex when you're talking about a global issue, a nuclear nation, all of these kinds of things. And so now you've even got conversations of having to fight the lesser evil. And looking at, like, on a global scale, what could happen if this is far from worst case scenario, and it's terrible as it is. But to look at God and say, where is God? It's not that different than saying, well, is God rooting for one of these teams, this team or the other? It's like, well, I mean, to be honest with you, that may not be God's agenda.
Yeah. He
may not be on the same playing field that we are. And he's wanting to do, and I think his heart breaks for the sake of the vulnerable, the oppressed, especially when you see things like sick kids in hospitals and women and children who are the victims who are paying the greatest price in this. It's heartbreaking. God's on their side, I can promise you. But there's also some of those same kind of victims inside of Russia. God's on their side as well. But it's a very heartbreaking thing with no easy answers.
That's been the hardest thing to decipher too. Yeah. Like what we're seeing in front of us, just looking at it from a film perspective, is a clear hero, a clear villain, the David versus Goliath story in many ways. and then there's this juxtaposition of rooting for the underdog, if you will, right? Zelensky, comedian, actor,
Totally.
president, wartime president, like what?
Yeah, exactly.
Against, and he's giving
It's
address.
made for TV.
It's made for TV.
Yeah.
And he's giving addresses in T-shirts, in military green T-shirts, walking the streets, embracing today's technology, using selfie videos. By the way, I saw a deep fake video that Russia posted of, it looks legit, man. Zelensky's like, we're surrendering, it's over. Misinformation war. It's crazy.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
But it goes to show you the power of image. Even like, I'm not saying that I think Zelensky's on the right side of this issue, but to your word, the juxtaposition of a smooth, polished, charismatic,
Extremely.
communicator.
Doesn't even speak English, and I'm still all about it.
Versus somebody that's almost robotic and cold and distance. You see the pictures of Putin at a table all by himself. And
Which are from him, which
Yeah.
even makes you like, what are you
so I
trying to
think
say to the
even
world?
you see in our day and age how image, even over message, has its own intrigue to us. We want to lean into the person who's just likable,
Yeah.
even if he wasn't in the right.
It's like a Marvel movie.
Totally. Absolutely.
It's just crazy. Okay. So here's the dilemma. We're bystanders, right? Like we at the end of the day, we
Right.
can protest and we can tell our government what we want, but they're going to choose, Biden, Congress, they're going to choose what they're going to choose based off the interests of the United States. Probably business-minded
Absolutely.
mostly, it seems like. But my question is, like I was saying earlier, my instinct says participate.
Right.
Help those that are hurting, but we can't engage militarily. So what can I or us in the Inland Empire,
Yep.
what can we do?
Yeah.
What can we do?
It is the age-old question for something that's distant. So the first response answers are, we can pray. And there's this weird thing, even amongst Christians, pray, like, is that a lot? That's like, what good is that going to do? And we downplay this biblical significance of a gift that God has given to say, no, pray. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I'll hear from them. I'll heal their land. There's these like audacious promises God has in prayer. So like we do that. We've talked about that. We give. Like this weekend, we made this decision this past weekend. Every single cent that comes in for about a week period, every cent that comes in Hillside, we're giving financially to 3 strategic partners. And that's one thing we can do. I think in some cases, we're going to be the kind of people who look for opportunities to house refugees. There's the short term, like give money, we pray. Then there's the long term. How do we help refugees? How do we help over the long haul? I think there is that initial impulse. I mean, there's like amazing stories, 9/11, so-and-so, they were so moved, they just went down to the office of the armed forces and they surrendered and they signed up and they went and did their thing. And maybe, I would say don't be rash. That's not necessarily, as a married man, that's not your decision to make all by yourself.
Oh, she's coming too. She said she's in
She
too.
doesn't have a choice. So I think there's a prayerful consideration, but there's also activities that we can take, and there are steps to say, how can we do? Like the reality is, we live outside of LA. There are all kinds of refugees from all kinds of nations within a 30-minute drive of where we live. We need our hearts to break with compassion. We need to see like God sees, but then sometimes God says, I want you to do something about this. And we're like, no, I just want to feel bad from a distant
Or I want my
place.
entertainment.
Totally. The getting up close and serving and sacrificial is, at the end of the day, what actually matters. Not the being consumed with content, but then never doing anything with it. And I think in a real way, God says, I want you to do something with it. Part of what you're doing is you're helping this group of young men process world events. You're helping a young man who's saying, I may be one of the ones on the battlefield in 2 years. How do I process this? Well, one of the ways is you process in community. You're not alone in this. We're going to pray for you, but also be here to bounce ideas off of you. And so one of the ways is we help each other. You're not alone in this. Like the things that you feel, Jared, need to be processed with others, not just contained within inside of you, and then you eventually just burst because you can't take it anymore. We need to have these kinds of conversations, not just with cameras rolling, but like over a meal, over a coffee or whatever, to say, what can we do? There's a lot we can do. And sometimes I think it just takes, let's think creatively. Let's think in a helpful way. There's already people doing amazing things. And the stories that I've heard from churches and organizations that are in Ukraine, and they are like frontline battle going into those towns, and say the history of Christianity and its growth has often been in the midst of plagues and wars. When everybody else is running scared to death, Christians stayed and Christians served.
Oh, I just got chills.
And the people that they ministered to became Christians because they saw the love of Jesus wasn't just something you talk about, it's something you live in the moment of great crisis. And so I think we have a similar opportunity in this moment.
Just personal question for you.
Yeah.
Outside of being a pastor, you're a man with kids.
Yeah.
Two still in high school.
Yep.
Will's still in high school, right?
He is, yeah.
These kids have bright futures ahead of them, and
Yeah.
if you watch the news, you'd think we're on the brink of nuclear war.
Yeah.
How are you processing all this as just
that's
the
great.
man, not the job?
So
not
our
the-
kids are 19, 18, and 16. One in college, two junior in high school. We also have a very interesting family dynamic. We've been in a very, very intense cancer journey for 13 years. So like trauma's not unusual. Crisis is not unusual for our family. We made a decision 13 years ago. Do the math, I don't know. Our kids were pretty young, like 4, 5, and 7 when our daughter was diagnosed with brain cancer. We made a decision. We're not going to shield them from reality. We're not going to lie to them. And I don't mean like deceptive lie, but I mean, and I also don't mean like all of the details of the truth, but we're like, one of the things that we have to let them do is feel for their ages appropriate pressure, appropriate weight. We as the parents carry the great weight. But we also need our kids to know, like, hey, this is what your sister's going through. We don't want to hide that. And it was, in that case, obvious. So, like, I think part of our thing for our kids is we want them to feel the weightiness of the world. This is that time of life where you'd rather just not look at that on your Instagram. You'd rather look at the fun stuff or on TikTok. I don't want to deal with that reality. I want to use it to escape, but it's inescapable in a moment like this. And so I think the biggest thing is just do everything that we can to stay in a conversation. And, if you're staying in a conversation about everything, then you can probably stay in a conversation about important things. If you're like, no, as a parent, we only want to talk about the important things, but we don't want to enter the silly. Well, it's like you got to enter all of it so that you can also talk about the important. My wife is a great conversationalist, so I don't know where we would be without her. We watch the news in our house, but the news is not on in the background in our house much. When we watch it, we want to engage, and then we don't want it on anymore. I think it's become background noise for a lot of our homes. The news in some places is on 24/7. And it's like, that's not good for anybody. That is not good for any of us. And so just being careful not to do that.
I'm going to wrap up with this question. It's kind of a blend of two questions here, but what do you see as the outcome of this? And I don't mean militarily.
Right.
How does our society here change after what feels like, and I'm going to group COVID into this too, but what feels like just 2 years of going back to the Stone Age. I mean, we're talking about viruses and wars in 2020 to 2022.
Right.
Couldn't be a better time to be a history teacher. Man, what am I doing?
It's lived out every day.
Yeah, but where are we headed? Where are we headed after all this as a societally?
Yeah, I have a lot of random thoughts. I'll try to be succinct. Like, I think on one level, never in human history have we been so bombarded with this kind of global devastation. It's not just that we hear about it. In the old days, you would hear about it. You would hear about it 3 weeks later as the news traveled around the world. Now it's a moment later. We're seeing it on wherever social media platform or news. We're entertained by it. We watch it play out on social media. We're not meant to live that way. We are not meant to live with the weight of every country and village of the world before us all the time. It actually disconnects us from local engagement sometimes. Now, I'm not saying globalization is bad. I'm saying we can be so fixated on what's going on in the world, we're not paying attention to what's going on in our own neighborhood. And so how do we have compassion but not be consumed? That's a really, really thing. But like I was thinking about this question, the irony of the pandemic is this. In the midst of the pandemic, it's every person for themselves. It's every country, every state, every county, every city, every church, every family.
And you're even told that. Yes. You're told, go home, stay home.
Yeah. Now all of a sudden, it's global and we're all in. Come on, let's do this. And I'm like, whoa, what whiplash.
Yeah, that's extreme.
You went from isolated to we're all in this together. And it's like, this is really crazy. However, I cannot recommend enough the Rebuilders podcast. It's from Mark Sayers. He's pastor of Red Church in Australia. Rebuilders. On March 1st and March 9th, he did 2 episodes on Ukraine, just I think simply called Ukraine. Listen to those. Those are amazing. I've been so helped by those. But I think back to September 11th attacks in 2011, and it was a spiked moment, similar to this one, but it was just one day. And the urgency waned almost as quickly as it came. Like there was this uprising, but the truth is, a week later, a couple weeks later, it was sort of dying out. The Gulf War in 1991, Operation Desert Storm was intense. I was in high school. I remember coming home, turning on the TV and watching Scud missiles and rockets launch and all that kind of stuff.
I was in diapers.
Yeah, but the moment I walked out of my living room, there wasn't a TV anywhere else. And I didn't have access until I went into my living room with one TV. Now it's on our phones. We're surrounded by it. My friends who are a little bit older than me talk about the Cold War dilemma and drills in school. Get under your desk. A nuclear bomb may explode. And like, what's a wooden desk going to do to help you from a nuke? And so they lived with this fear. What Mark Sayers says is so helpful to me. We think this is abnormal. And what we were living through in earlier days was normal. You know, we've had relative peace, relative prosperity. Things have been pretty good. And all of a sudden, a pandemic turns everything upside down. And now this war feels like, is it going to spread to other places? And what Mark Sayers says is, historically, that's probably more normal than abnormal. We got used to living in the abnormal peace and prosperity, where so much of the world has lived in always heightened tension, fear, divisiveness. All of these things have been a bigger part of the story. We've had this sort of reprieve, but now we're back in it. So where do we go from this? I mean, that's a massive, massive question. I think we have to learn to live in the midst of conflict and division and keep our hearts filled with peace and centered on Jesus. I think one of the things that as a follower of Christ, I am called to do, lead my family and hopefully lead a church, is how do we stay focused on Jesus and also aware of the hurts and the needs all around us. Not so that we're overwhelmed and consumed by the needs around us, but that in Christ we have the resources, the wisdom, the discernment, and even the talent use in the right ways to help meet the hurts and the needs of the world. So that we don't feel overwhelmed, like it's not a surprise. Jesus isn't like, oh my gosh, Russia's doing what? Took me by storm. It's like, no. I think his heart breaks for those who are under attack and scared to death. His heart breaks, and our heart should break for those things too. But we go back to that earlier verse that I was talking about. Jesus literally says, but if you're weary and burdened, come to me, I'll give you rest. So we find the rest we need in Jesus so that we can then enter the weary, broken world and bring help and bring hope and point to a right place. We just finished a Revelation series here. You know that. And so as we read the end of the story.
Which is bizarre, which is a little bizarre.
It is bizarre. But when we read the end of the story, what we see is things are working to a consummation that is restorative, that is reconciling, that all of these things that are broken and unjust and evil and all those things. They're going to be dealt with, but there are some rough days in order to get there. But we hold on to this hope that God is still in control, and he's guiding history to where it's going to go. It doesn't make it any easier, but I think this is probably what we're going to have to get used to. And we're going to have to learn to be both global citizens who care and are involved, but also local citizens who, when I was young and starting out in ministry, I probably did this 1,000 times. Jeremiah 29:11, God has plans to give you hope and a future and all these kinds of good things. God's in control. You can trust him. Completely ignoring the first 10 verses of that chapter. And the first 10 verses of that chapter basically are, you're in exile. You're living in a foreign land. It's difficult. You feel like a stranger. You don't fit in. So what do? God basically says, this is off my memory, basically, start a family, build a house, plant a garden, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city that you're in. He's not saying escape. He's not saying run for your life. He's saying seek the peace of where you live. And if you can do that, and I can do that, and Christians following Jesus all over the place can say, let's do that right where we are. Then we rise up as a light in a dark place, and we have purpose, and we have hope. And together we find strength because we encourage one another. All hope is not gone. Yes, this is incredibly difficult and it's dark, but God is still in control of those who think they are in control. And there's an end. There's an end to evil. And I don't understand why God is allowing the things to happen that are happening right now. And I wish he wouldn't. And I pray that he'll put it to an end quickly. In the meantime, we keep praying and we seek to do the right thing and keep our eyes on Jesus. That doesn't
feel a lot better. No, it doesn't answer. I mean, yeah, it's hard because, later on tonight, I know I'm going to be sitting there and I'm going to hit my app and I'm going to read that extremely clever headline from whatever news, and I'm going to get sucked back in.
You're going to be drawn into it, yeah.
Yeah, but
just counteract that with another, habit. You don't have to stop doing that because you like to be informed, but there's a boundary.
Yeah.
And keeping within boundaries and saying, for the amount of garbage that goes in, I'm going to allow some things that are life-giving to come in. And I'm not saying news is garbage necessarily, but it's not always helpful. It's not always peace-giving.
Well, Pastor Aaron, thank you for sitting down with me.
You're welcome. And one day you will call me Aaron.
Nope, not going to happen.
Thanks for these questions. They were really helpful, Jared.
Yes, sir.